I think there's no doubt that teacher recruitment is getting more challenging year on year. We are not meeting some of the targets. Secondly, the position is very different by different subjects and different phases. The reasons are complex, so pupil numbers are forecast, and obviously it's future forecasts of pupil numbers that drive teacher numbers, because we need to know how many teachers we're going to need 3, 4, 5 years in the future. We're expecting pupil numbers to go up. That means we will need more teachers overall, so that makes the position more challenging. The second reason is to do with the economy. The blue line is economic growth, and the bars are the rate at which applications for teaching profession are rising or falling. And very roughly, there's a correlation between these things. So when the economy collapsed in 2009, we had 2 very good years for teacher recruitment afterwards. Things have got steadily harder since the economy has been recovering. This is a picture about the overall teacher recruitment position, how the numbers stack up. The green arrow in the top left here of about 23,000 a year, that's the number of newly qualified teachers that we're recruiting. But it's worth saying the overall recruitment position is much more complex than that. There are important things which drive the numbers: retirements, deaths, leaving the profession, and so on. This slide, I think, has a slightly different message, and this is where things become a bit more intriguing and a bit more difficult to explain, is actually a position of some stability. Teacher numbers have gone up over the last 15 years. That's because pupil numbers have gone up. The level of vacancies in the system isn't very different from any of those years. The pupil-teacher ratio, which is an important driver of the numbers as well, is fairly stable. Temporarily filled posts are also fairly stable. So I think it's interesting, certainly in terms of understanding what kind of problem we have and what's actually going on. What this slide does is basically show what percentage of teachers who enter the profession in a particular year were still teaching in a state-funded school a given number of years afterwards. And I put this up partly for myth-busting purposes, because there's lots of comment and numbers flying around about teacher recruitment at the moment. There is a figure that I sometimes hear about 40 or 50% of teachers leaving the profession within 5 years. If you look at the top line, teachers who entered the profession in 1996, 52% of them were still in teaching 17 years later. I think the overall picture from that is actually, again, of some stability in terms of teacher retention. Next slide is about vacancy rates, and there are different opinions about vacancy rates and what they tell you. So some people say vacancy rates don't really tell you anything, because the school will put anyone in front of a class rather than carry a vacancy and won't declare it. Other people take a different view. First of all, they're all very low, but secondly, some of them are much bigger than others. So one thing that we've been doing recently is to try and dig in a little bit more into local vacancy data, because I think in the department we have an awful lot of data about the national picture. I think what we understand far less well is what perspective the national picture casts on the local position. And what this slide does is it compares vacancy rates in 3 different authorities by school. In the first one, almost all schools have almost no vacancies, but that's an area which really doesn't have any teacher vacancies at all. The second one, the great majority of schools don't have any vacancies, but there are quite a number. The third one, I think, tells a similar story, but with a different distribution. So I think the story of that slide is not that there is a general teacher recruitment crisis, it's that different areas are facing different sorts of challenges and possibly behaving in different sorts of ways. So this data needs further analysis. So the sort of thing it might be picking up, and we don't know yet, is that schools with high level vacancies are perhaps particularly schools which are struggling, schools which are in category. Maybe that's true. That was a very quick trot through some interesting data. I don't think it tells you very clearly that things are good or bad. I think it tells you that things are complicated and that there's more to look at. But is the situation now very different to previous years? And if so, how? If we are going to address it, we need to know exactly what kind of problem we're dealing with and where. Next question is, I think, really about how good you think that data is, whether that chimes in with your experience or whether it tells a completely different story. Third question is about national and local data and how far they're telling us different things. And finally, do we have a good enough insight into what actually attracts people into teaching generally? Because again, I think since we face greater competition from rising private sector wages in the private sector, I think getting a better fix on exactly why it is that people want to come into teaching and trying to make it more attractive would help.
I began my teacher training in 2012, and whilst I can say there have been times I've paused to wonder how I am managing to do my job, I haven't looked back since. As part of my preparation for today, I interviewed 11 colleagues and 2 teacher trainees. The first question I asked was, why did you go into teaching? Some gave some quite fair and pragmatic responses, that teaching suited their home lives, that it offers a secure career path and clear routes for progression. Of course, the small factor of the long holidays did come up. But more importantly are the answers that make teaching stand out from any other job or many other jobs. For many, they had always wanted to be teachers, whereas others, the desire to join the profession had come from school or work experiences. They gave lots of reasons, a mixture of them, as to why they joined the profession, from love of their subject, thirst for challenge and creativity, and the desire not to work in an office doing the same thing day in, day out. But don't worry, I haven't forgotten the most important thing, and that is our students. The teachers I interviewed wanted to make a difference to young people, to their development, and to give them the opportunities that they themselves had had when they were at school. Out of the 11 colleagues I interviewed, 8 of them had considered leaving teaching within the last 5 years, so I asked why. To begin with, many felt that the regularly changing goalposts within teaching, such as new government strategies or Ofsted criteria, can be frustrating in teaching. Not only is it frustrating for us, but it's also frustrating for our learners. It seems that as soon as we've got used to one new strategy, new set of goalposts, these change again. Now, of course, developments within teaching are great and are welcomed, but we do need the time to test them and to implement them. I asked the teachers I interviewed on average how many hours they work a week, and all said between 60 and 70. High workload is not only tiring, but it can impact heavily on home life, and this is something I found particularly difficult in NQT year and continue to find difficult. Teachers I interviewed also find that this is a cause for concern for them. And I think the oddest thing that came out of the interviews was the word guilt. If we take an evening off to recharge or spend time with our families, we feel guilty for not working. Another aspect I wasn't prepared for in teaching that came up a lot in the interviews was the high levels of pressure, accountability and professionalism required in teaching, and many feel this is not reflected in their pay. As trainees, you have little insight into this part of teaching and are suddenly hit with it as you begin your NQT year. Teachers and schools are constantly under scrutiny, and as teaching is personal, we do feel we are more sensitive to this and feel this more keenly. Within this, the recently qualified and newly qualified teachers I interviewed felt that they were often pushed into developing quickly and being fast-tracked into management, feeling that their primary job, teaching, can be put to the wayside. All the teachers I interviewed also felt undervalued. This was mostly due to outside views of teaching and our portrayal in the media. When I was in my 4th year of my university degree, I was discussing becoming a teacher with my peers. Many of them said, "Why would you want to do that?" And clearly felt that teaching was not a profession of choice, but something people do because they can't think of anything else. Other teachers I interviewed had experienced this view and had also experienced the view repeatedly that teachers work 9 to 3, don't care much about the students and are just in it for the holidays. This is really frustrating and is a view that is encouraged by the teacher bashing we can see and hear in the media. And interestingly, when I asked my 2 trainee students if they felt that their expectations before joining the school matched up with the reality, they said that in fact they walked around school, felt a really positive atmosphere between students and staff, and that this really didn't tally up with what they had read in the media. So I asked teachers if they had any solutions. To start, there was a consensus that teacher training needs to be more realistic. New teachers could be more prepared, could teach more hours and be exposed to more marking. Many said that they were happy with the amount of work we do for students in terms of planning personalised learning, tracking data and keeping up to date with pastoral issues. They felt that this is valuable and can only help our students, but we do need the time in the working day to do each task and each student justice. Having one less class perhaps could make a difference so we could focus fully on the others, and this may also help to reduce workload. Finally, we'd like more support from the government and the media so that the profession is once again valued, respected and the work of teachers recognised. We do love our job. We do love the feeling of reward when a student understands something or overcomes a personal obstacle, and we do love that every day is different. We wish everyone else could see this and see that this is why we are still here, doing the best we can for our students, in spite of the challenges within teaching.
With the national teacher shortage already more than 5,000 and rising, I was asked today to put forward a university perspective on this debate. And really what I wanted to focus on was the principles of a recruitment system that is able to deliver both quality and quantity. But I wanted first of all to settle a bit of a myth. And sometimes people talk to me about the fact that universities are in teacher training to make money. They are not. If this is actually done properly, teacher training actually costs universities money. They make nothing from it. it in a financial sense. And there's also quite a lot of reputational risks for universities as well. For example, this is one of the only avenues in which Ofsted can actually make a judgment on universities. Now, I should say the financial and reputational risks have always existed, and they're not a result of any kind of recent policy or move towards a schools-led system. However, one of the big issues for universities now on top of those things is a kind of fracturing, in my view, of the recruitment and admissions system, which has seen universities competing directly with schools in some cases, and that's actually increased the risk of universities being unable to recruit viable cohorts or to plan effectively over the long term. It's a kind of year-on-year planning cycle, which makes it, again, more unattractive for universities to get involved. And if you add to that the tightening of consumer rights laws that we've seen recently in the higher education sector, which in the context of teacher training may actually require universities to perform the impossible task of providing trainees with details of their school placements at the point of application. You might reasonably ask, why are universities still involved in teacher training at all? Well, some aren't anymore. To my knowledge, 5 institutions have already left. But for those that have stayed, really they've stayed because they feel they have a moral responsibility to support local schools and also to nurture potential scholars who may well contribute to academic disciplines in the future. And I think that's of particular importance when you think there might be decreasing numbers in some of those smaller academic disciplines in universities as well, as a chance to inspire that next generation of people there. The traditional PGCE is in many ways, I think, a kite mark of quality, both in the UK and overseas, and is often seen as the gold standard for those people who are actually working towards qualified teacher status. For example, many SCIT providers, so when I say SCIT, I'm talking about those schools who can award QTS themselves, they're actually approaching universities to say, well, alongside our award of QTS, will you also look at what we do and think about accrediting that with a PGCE as well? And I think that's a recognition of that quality. And I think it's also worth saying that there's an increasing number of British providers who are successfully delivering international PGCEs that come without QTS. And I think, again, it's that recognition of the quality that PGCEs bring them. I think we should be careful not to underestimate the impact of international teacher recruitment requirements on our own recruitment efforts here in the UK. A statistic that surprised me when I heard it, there are actually more British schools overseas than there are state schools in the UK. If you think that the growth in the international market is such that the number of international schools is set to triple in the next 10 years, and you think about the corresponding demand for teachers that comes with that, there's a real issue. And guess what? The key market for exporting teachers into those schools is ours, the British market. I think we spend a lot of time here criticising education, our own education in this country. But the truth is that British education is the envy of the world, in spite of what international league tables might tell us. If we get back to the teacher supply and training routes within England, I think there are 3 key advantages to university-led routes which are worth flagging. First of all, recruitment power. Quality recruitment at scale is the bread and butter of many universities. They are good at it. They've got systems and processes in place to attract a large number of quality applicants to the profession, and they're well placed to, in my view, fully address the current recruitment issue. The problem we've got is that their recruitment is capped primarily for political reasons. In a time of teacher shortage, that just makes no sense to me. Surely the limit should be about recruiting a required number of teachers rather than limiting or predetermining the choice of training route. Secondly, university-led training is by its very nature research-informed and research-inspired. Trainees' practice is very closely linked with research, thereby creating an improving and developing system. This recognises that quality teaching 10 years ago is different to quality teaching today and will be different to what it looks like in 10 years' time. Without that external input, we create a system which kind of feeds itself. Now, of course, that does amplify existing good practice, which is great, but it also creates this kind of artificial glass ceiling because we've got this closed system, and I think we need to be really careful about that. And lastly, university-led provision, I think, is well placed to deal with the inevitable situations when training doesn't quite work out the way we'd planned, when they make mistakes. Because we're one step removed from the classroom, we can have university tutors that actually support the trainee and can give them those second chances or fresh starts in a way that's about training. Whereas if you're actually employed by your training provider, that sometimes these things can turn into kind of HR issues and employment type issues, which aren't quite as straightforward. I mean, the reality is that the first priority for schools, quite rightly, is the students in those schools. And therefore, if you've got trainees in there as well, sometimes there is a conflict. And I think universities universities do bring that kind of impartiality to be able to put the trainees first, sometimes when that's appropriate. My concern is that at a time of national teacher recruitment shortage, there are these artificial caps which are placed on universities. Every year, when the School Direct programme fails to recruit the required number of trainees, we get the phone call, universities, can you step in and do some last-minute recruitment for us? In 13-14, 2/3 of the places were filled on School Direct, whereas PGCE's recruited to 90%. I think there's also another issue, which is that when universities recruit potential teachers, they're looking at recruiting people for the profession. And the reality is that when schools recruit, they're actually recruiting people for the profession and in that specific school. And what that means is that sometimes we're in a position where schools say no to very high quality applicants because they're not right for that school. So my own view is that this is really about partnership. It shouldn't matter really whether we're talking about a schools-led provision or a university-led provision if we actually recognise what we're good at. And we do that with a genuine sense of partnership, we can actually make this work. But I think the system is set up at the moment in a way that it doesn't always make partnership as easy as it could be. The last thing I should say is that we haven't mentioned the professional skills tests yet. These are kind of numeracy and literacy tests, which are at the moment a condition of entry to get onto a training course. There used to be a barrier of entry to the profession, and that's been shifted. If I give you an example, let's say I do a history of art degree and I haven't done any maths since I did GCSE, and now all of a sudden I have to do mental maths at speed in test conditions, and if I don't get that right, I can't be a teacher. I don't think that's really fair. What we can do is work with people when they're actually on the training course to get them up to that level if they need those skills, but we shouldn't, again, have that leakage in the system where we're losing good people. So let me finish with a warning, really. I think in this push, in this drive for a schools-led system, we've got to be very careful that we don't push universities out of teacher education altogether. Otherwise, we risk failing an entire generation of young people, and that simply cannot be acceptable.
Being called a teacher is one thing, but earning the title of a good or excellent teacher is another. Anyone can teach. Simple. All you really need to be good at is explaining things. You're probably thinking, is this girl okay? I mean, if teaching was so easy, why on earth are we seeing a shortage of teachers across the UK? It's no use being considered a teacher if you're merely going to provide your students with textbooks to copy from and exams to face. You might as well just give up and work in McDonald's instead. A good teacher is someone who is passionate in their subject area and willing to pass that on to their pupils. A teacher's job should be to inspire, motivate, and drive our current and future generations to success. The reason why we have developed into the individuals that we are today with a passionate, determined, and inquisitive approach to learning new things is through the guidance of our teachers. Even the most intelligent pupils still require a teacher to not only provide them with information, because that's Google's job obviously, but to interact with them as humans, not robots. Let's use Albert Einstein as an example of an individual with an unbelievable mind. Well, he was inspired by his lecturer to come up with a theory of relativity after a little school trip to the Severn River. Education isn't all about preparing you for employment. It's about making changes, creating opportunities, being more open-minded, which is why we need excellent teachers. But we can't do this alone. A teacher is nothing without a student, and a student is nothing without a teacher. They both work together towards success. We, as intelligent human beings, have the ability and power to make a change. How many times have we come across a problem but solved it by working together? Yes, there is a shortage of teachers in the UK, but we should remain optimistic and use what we have already learned to inspire the growth of even more teachers.
What we've been doing at Schools Week is trying to look at what are the things that are actually happening. We've got one person saying, 40% of people don't leave in the first few years of teaching, and someone else saying on here, adding that they do. Depends where you begin from. If we look at teacher training through to the end of the first year of teaching, about 40% of people don't end up becoming teachers from the beginning of training. If we go from the beginning point, as Marcus did, of when people start as teachers, actually we're not really losing anybody else. It's about the same as it has been for the last 15 years. So the argument that teaching is so horrific, everybody is fleeing, isn't yet backed up by the retention figures. We can't say that for definite. You're absolutely right though, Adam, on the international schools. We recently revealed 18,000 teachers last year went to teach just in international British schools abroad. That was more than were trained to be teachers in universities last year. There's also an issue here around those figures that Marcus showed that look very, very tiny, so the temporary rates and the vacancy rates. Now, there's a reason why they look very tiny, and it's to do with the part of the year where they're taken. What's very noticeable, though, the temporary filled rate was 0.5%, and then it became 0.9%. The vacancy rate was 0.1%, and then it became 0.3%. So they sound tiny, but that rate of change you've got one almost doubling and one trebling is a problem. Because what we know is that when we have these changes, they can move very, very rapidly. I agree, the retention figures, it's not that people are disappearing. Recruitment figures, there are some issues, and it doesn't look that bad, but actually it's growing. And so if we're not at shortage or crisis or anything else, there's a good potential that we could get there. So what's causing it? The easy answer is it's the economy. But let's look back early in the 2000s period. Actually, 2004, 2005, those were really good economic years. We actually had managed to get the London problem back on track and people wanted to be teachers. But it's not that straightforward to say the economy is good, so no one wants to be a teacher. Actually, with young graduates in particular who make up the most of entry, the media can do very little. This is a group who've just spent 15, 18 years in classrooms. Their understanding of what teachers are is much like Halter's. It's from their own teachers. It's from their own experiences. So the attractiveness of teaching is actually quite a difficult one to do on entry. So we've still got this issue. Numbers say it's fine. Everybody else says it's a nightmare. What's happening? There is an issue in that there is a number of teachers, we believe, who are either being moved on when schools are being taken over. So currently, schools that are languishing are being turned around very, very quickly. As part of that process, a lot of staff are being moved on. Some of those staff feel very tired, very got at. They sometimes feel the accountability, the responsibility now in schools is very, very high. So they would rather work temporarily and not have many of the responsibilities that you have when you're a permanent employee in schools. And what we've got, we think, is this kind of small percentage possibly of people moving around in the system, or a group of people that are not being helped to develop their skills further and now no longer getting jobs. So they're sitting on the books somewhere as temporary teachers, which is why that vacancy rate doesn't shoot up, but people don't necessarily want to hire them because they don't feel like they've got adequate skills, and that's why head teachers feel like there aren't enough teachers out there. And then the second one, and this is the straightforward, honest answer for me. I really don't want to have to explain how you become a teacher to anybody at the moment. It is so complicated. We've had a situation this week with teacher training in the recruitment caps where PE teaching, all these young people who've suddenly been told that your interviews are worthless, you've got to go to a school now and apply there, but how do they know which schools have got the spaces? Do they have to, while they're trying to do their finals, they've got to put in 10 different applications? If you're 21 and 22 and the economy is good and really good milk round recruiters are coming around to you saying, fill in one form, we'll pay you £30,000, we'll train you to be an accountant, or you can now run around the country trying to apply to 10 different schools to try and work out how you can possibly become a teacher. We have made it too complicated, but as it stands, that complication is too big a barrier as far as we can see on the evidence. If we could find these tired teachers, and if we could just make that entry a little bit more simplistic, then I think we could just get through this and it would be fine.